Hello, Ethel.
Hello, James. Nice to speak to you again.
Yes, you too. So this time we're going to have a wee look at both book 3 and the book 4. I want to start with book 3, Desperate Times. And what I wanted to start with, because I find it really interesting, was the poem right at the start by Finola Scott. I just wanted to read a wee bit of it. Out on the moss, Brown lifted his head to assumed as he cut peat after family worship. In summer mist he was hainin worth again sair winter, but it wasna a peasy weep welcoming the morn, it was sojers. And I think that is quite interesting, based on the fact that, there's all this military activity going on in and around through the books. And I found that to be quite interesting. Was that a poem that had already been written, or was it something that she wrote, in response to a request?
Finola wrote that poem particularly for that book.
Right.
She's very good at tapping in to what is actually required to give you the essence of something. It's a skill that she really does have. So each one is in each book individual, and especially for that one. And I feel very honoured that she, goes to that trouble, because to me it does make a difference.
Oh, it does, because, I know a lot of people, when they read books, they go straight to the first chapter. They don't really read any of the preamble, if you like. But I read everything right up to before I start to read the actual story.
I tend to be like that too. I think it's because I'm just extra nosy.
Possibly. But also, I like to quote again, this time from Mark Twain: under certain circumstances, profanity provides a relief denied even to prayer. And it made me smile when I read it, and it makes me smile every time I read it, because I think, from my point of view, I often find that to be quite true,
I would agree with you, yes.
Not being a particularly religious person or profane person, I might add, but there are times, when I do find a good sweary word helps to relieve the tension.
Well, I felt that picking that particular quote to me was appropriate, because as you go through the book, not just John Steele, but various people get to the end of their tether, and it bursts out. It's a natural reaction. And whether they feel better for it or not, they do it. And it's a human thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when I saw it, I thought, oh, that does belong there.
It's funny, isn't it, how, you come across certain things like quotations and stuff like that just seem to knit really well into the narrative,
Yeah, and the thing is, it happens accidentally. It just sort of happens, and you think, all right. And you note it down, and then when you go back to it, you think, yes, I could use that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a wee look towards the book. Cameron has left his mortal coil. Lucas Brotherston is back on the run, needing to get to Holland, and obviously being ably supported by John Steele once again. But there is a twist there. When I started to read it, I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, we're going to get him back to Holland, and he's going to settle, and things will move along quite nicely. And then you kind of threw the spanner in the works a wee bit with me when he gets caught.
That was very deliberate.
Could you maybe give me a wee bit of an insight into why you kind of went along that route?
Well, I went along that route because of Lucas's character. Lucas is a weak man.
Yeah.
He's a great theorist, but he's not in the real world in a real sense that most people are. The real world, when it touches him, upsets him, and he can't cope with it. And I felt that as a minister of the cloth, he was letting himself down and the church, in inverted commas, down. And that really he deserves to get some kind of comeuppance. So that's why I did it. He's getting his comeuppance.
So, quite an interesting way to put it. Getting his comeuppance. Quite a comeuppance to get as well.
It was a bit. To tell you the truth, I quite enjoyed writing that bit.
I actually enjoyed reading it as well, you know.
Oh, good.
As I said, although it was different from what I thought was going to happen with him, once I had gone through the chapters, you know, where he gets caught and, you know, he goes to the Bass Rock and all the rest of it, I felt that there was a real honest ending there. Because of the type of person, the type of character that he was.
Yes.
As I said, don't want to go into too much detail again for anybody who's not read book 3 yet, you know, as to what actually happens to him. But I don't think I'm letting too many cats out the bag when I say that he ends up on the Bass Rock.
Indeed.
Which even I knew before reading your books was quite notorious historically.
It certainly wasn't the best place to be.
And I've actually visited the Bass Rock. I don't know if you did as part of your
Yes, I did.
work on it, did you? And I found it very interesting. I didn't actually get onto it.
Mm-hmm.
The day that we were going across, it was quite choppy and it was making it difficult for us to be able to land. But even just being in a boat and being up close to it, after having seen it from the mainland, I just thought to myself at the time, I wouldn't want to have to try and get away from here.
Well, you couldn't actually get away from it. No one ever escaped from it.
Yeah.
You'd need to be a hell of a strong swimmer for a start. And also the diet that they were on.
Yeah.
It was iron rations and some. Because the only water that the poor souls drank was the water that they gathered from the holes in the rock.
Right.
They weren't given water.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually on the very top of the rock, there was a grassy patch where there were some sheep. So you would think, well, that was to feed everyone on the rock, but it wasn't. It was only for the garrison. The men were just eating gruel and drinking, well, quite often filthy water. Yeah. So a lot of them actually died of malnutrition or some terrible illness, although one or two of them did survive to tell the tale. And one of the most interesting ones, who does appear in the book now and again, is Sandy Peden.
Yeah.
He actually got off the rock. He actually is such an interesting character. You could almost write a book about him. He had been captured and sent to the Bass Rock. He was actually a very gentle man and very much against violence. And he wasn't very popular with the societies or the avid Covenanters because of that. But anyway, to cut a long story short, he was sent to the Bass Rock to do 4 years. And after the 4 years were up, he thought, well, I've done my time. Maybe the great and the good, I'll write to the Privy Council and say to them, I've done my time, can I come off? So the Privy Council got the letter and they sent for him. And Sandy thought, well, maybe I'm going to get off. So he was taken back to Edinburgh, taken before the Privy Council, only to discover that that was the last of their thoughts. What they were going to do with him was to send him to the Americas as a slave. And he was marched with a whole lot of other Covenanters down to Leith docks and put on the St. Michael to be sent to America. Now, the person who was behind the paying of the boat was a London businessman. So the boat had to go to Gravesend first. And Sandy was credited with having second sight. There's a lot of evidence of things that he said were going to happen, or he saw things happening when he was miles away from them. But anyway, he told the other captives, don't worry, we're not going anywhere, we won't be slaves. And they all laughed at him. But when they docked at Gravesend and the businessman came on to inspect his charges, he discovered that they weren't felons, that they were men who had been locked up for their spiritual beliefs. And he refused to have any more to do with it. And there was quite a ding-dong between the captain and the businessman. And eventually, the captain just opened the hull and said, right, out you come. I've had enough. I've got no more responsibility for it. And out they all piled. And very slowly and gently, they all walked back to Scotland.
So, in a way, justice being served.
Yes.
In the end.
And also he was proved that him upstairs had told him something that was actually going to happen.
Yeah, I must admit, I think probably be quite interested to read a book about Sandy Peden.
There's lots more. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, just based on the bits and pieces from your own books, he just comes across as a real character,
The only person I've ever come across who actually has been buried 3 times. That doesn't happen very often. I'll not go into why and how it did happen. And I mean, he actually foretold this happening.
Right.
So it makes you think, well, what did he really know?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, when Lucas gets caught with John Sproul, who is an apothecary,
Yes.
in modern parlance, a chemist.
Yes. And John Sproul is a real person.
Oh, well, do you know, that was my next question.
Right.
How real was he, or how much was it, a kind of amalgamation of people that you'd read about?
No, he was entirely real. And as a kind of afterthought, long after this, when it was all over and he did live to tell the tale, he's credited, would you believe, for having backed the slave trade in Glasgow.
Oh, really?
So you see, yes. So there were 2 sides to him. To me, before that, he seemed very much a man of principle. But once he got out and went on with the rest of his life, I thought, oh my goodness, what's happened here? Whether it was being on the Bass Rock that did it to him or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's been quite a bit of correspondence in the Herald back and forward a few months ago about him. And how he shouldn't be given any of the reverence because he actually made a pile of money from that. Yeah. But then he had lost everything and he had to start again.
Yeah, so possibly maybe to try and put a bit of a positive spin on it for him, it was necessity that maybe drove him to it, from a business point of view.
I think so. Yeah. I that's the only conclusion I can come to, because they thought differently then.
Yeah, absolutely.
They did. And it was a matter of starting again with nothing, and where do I go? And this is an opportunity, and I go down that line. I could be entirely wrong, but it just seems so out of character.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you consider everything that he did for Lucas to try and help him, because obviously when he gets to the Rock, he really does suffer, Lucas, partly because of the conditions, but also more than probably because of his own personal character, not being able to deal with these situations. And he just really gives him, or tries his best to give him everything, and every support that he possibly can.
Very much so.
Which again kind of completely counteracts, what happened later on, as you say, about him getting involved in slave trade. But
by this time you're into the 1700s. It's all past with. So maybe as you grow older, you change. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I always think that he reached out to somebody who had terrible mental problems.
Yeah.
And did his best for him.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, what happens on the Bass Rock happens on the Bass Rock. When we move a bit further forward, John gets tied up again, if you like, metaphorically speaking, with another rampant covenanter, James Rennick.
Yeah, James Rennick is something else.
I mean, having read about him in the book, I had this immediate picture of the sort of old style firebrand preacher, standing either at a pulpit or in a field, waving a Bible in his hand and screaming at the congregation about what they should and what they shouldn't do, but at the same time being very, very convincing and getting people to follow along with the way he's seeing things, which speaks greatly for him as an orator.
Oh yes, he was very, very good. But the thing that always surprises me is when he started, when he saw Donald Cargill being hung at the Grassmarket, he was only 18. He was dead by the time he was 26.
Yeah.
And it all happened. And also, when he was finally captured, and marched to the garrison in Edinburgh. The garrison captain took one look at him and said, "Is this the boy that was causing all the bother?" He was very small, very slim, fair-haired, and he looked young for his age.
Yeah.
Now, if you think of perhaps a couple of thousand Covenanters grouped in a field, and this wee boy walks out, they must have thought, "What's coming here?" But then when he opened his mouth, he seemed to have the power of persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
He definitely was something else.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because obviously you talk about the second proclamation that gets made by the Covenanters. This time they go directly to Lanark.
That's right.
Which is a real slap in the face of the authorities, in my opinion, much more so than the first declaration when it was posted.
Yes.
And again, obviously, this is historical fact. And I've looked it up myself, confirming it. Not that I didn't believe you, but, you know, it was interesting.
Just in case.
But it was just the fact that they were so bold. You know, I mean, they didn't do it in the darkness. You know, they went up there in full daylight, big crowd of them, made a big party of it, as it were, and on they went, you know, right under the nose of the authorities. Yeah,
and the only thing that was with them was it was January, so that probably there was less people about. That's the only thing that they had. Otherwise, it was really a confrontation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think it speaks for the boldness of Rennick as a character, you know, to sort of conceive of the idea of doing this. And then, of course, it kind of leads to quite a few problems for him going forward, because I might be wrong, but in my opinion, that seems to be the thing that gets him more noticed.
Yes,
and therefore becomes, you know, the public enemy number one, as it were.
Yeah, he's now in the same boat as Cameron.
Yeah.
We get rid of him, we get rid of the problem. And well, eventually, that's exactly what's going to happen. But in between, he causes quite a stramash.
He certainly does. But again, rather interestingly, for me, I found myself wanting them to succeed. You know, although I know from a historical perspective that wasn't going to happen, but when I'm reading it, I'm finding myself thinking, "Oh, come on, you know, you've got to do it. You know, you've got to get this." And when he's making his escape, you know, "Oh yeah, you've got to get away. You must get away." You know, and when he's coming back, I'm thinking, "No, don't come back. Don't come back."
Well, he was the kind of man who had very little thought for his own safety.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't think he had any thought for it. He really didn't care what was going to happen to him. And that was true right until, you know, the bitter end. And that's where, if I could maybe sort of interject, in that Robert Hamilton, who had been the leader at Bothwell Bridge, the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and had turned tail and run away and left all the Covenanters to a terrible fate, and it was awful.
Yeah.
And John Steele had been one of them and obviously had never forgiven them for it.
Yeah.
Now, Robert Hamilton was the man that really hyped up Rennick to go back. But Robert Hamilton didn't. He stayed safely in Holland and sent fiery letters to Rennick to keep the hype going.
Yeah, to keep him moving.
And that is where the politics of it comes in. And that's the bit that really I find rather unpleasant.
Yeah, because, I mean, when they're in Holland, obviously they come across him again. And John Steele, you know, quite rightly, is annoyed at the fact that this man seems to have such a position after what had happened at Bothwell. And he tries to tell people about it, but they're not really prepared to take that on board, you know. And I just think, when I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, just go up and, you know, batter him, kill him,
well,
you know.
I did actually think about putting that in, and then I thought, no, he wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Not in a public place, because whatever else John had, he had dignity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course he does, while he's in Holland, he does actually get revenge on Gabby.
Oh, yes.
Which took me by surprise.
Right.
Because, I mean, obviously we know that he'd escaped, but never
Where had he gone?
in a million years would I have imagined, you know, he would have gone to Holland.
But you see, it was quite easy to go and get a boat at Leith and, you know, hightail it away. And since he now had the money to do it, he did.
Yeah, but no, it was good.
And he was still the wee rat bag that he always was.
Exactly, absolutely. And that's why it was so good that he gets his comeuppance, you know, and John Steele gets a little bit of closure in that respect. But I was also interested by Jonas Hawthorne and his father Tobias, who obviously come into the book when they're in Holland, Tobias being a minister.
Yes.
And Jonas is his son. But again, I thought they were only going to be there for a couple of chapters.
Oh, no.
And it turned out not to be so, especially Jonas.
Yes, he's an important thread.
We'll go on to that a little later. But it was interesting to find that these were people who essentially were Scottish. Although Jonas, I'm right, he was born in Holland, so therefore he would have been Dutch. But to all intents and purposes, he's a Scotsman. Because whenever you're Scottish, you know, whether it's through birth and you're born here or your parents or your ancestors have moved elsewhere, you're always Scottish, you know, and I've found that to be true when I've travelled. And it was interesting that they were able to speak Scots.
Yes, that was quite important because it would have been very unbalanced with Jonas speaking English, you know, and John or whatever speaking in Scots. So the fact that he had a Scottish father, I thought, well, yes, he would. He would. And I'm sure he would. I'm sure he would.
Yeah. I mean, do you think in a real world situation, the fact that it's two separate languages, to all intents and purposes, would have created a barrier?
Yes, because there are a number of words in Scots that just don't ring true if you translate them into English.
Yeah.
And it gave them a connection between each other, that they were comfortable with each other and they knew what each was thinking because they were in the kind of the same mind plane.
Yeah.
And I felt that was quite important. Although Jonas is a lot younger than John, John actually looked at Jonas kind of like a younger version of himself, you know, who still had a lot to learn.
Yeah.
John had learned it, but John was still on his learning curve, and I think he'll be on his learning curve for quite a while because he is an impetuous kind of person.
Yeah, that definitely seems to come across more in book 2 into book 3 and then on into book 4. The sort of act now, think later side of John Steele.
Yes, and sometimes regret it.
Yeah, and I think his wife Marion, I'm pretty certain it's in book 3, at one point, she kind of points it out to him.
Yes.
You know, and she sort of lays the law down to him, but at the same time, I think she realises that he's not going to change.
Yeah, she knows that, but she tells him anyway. But the interesting thing about Marion is, if you go way back to book 1, it was Marion that really encouraged John to go to the first meeting in the first place. Yeah, absolutely. So she has been living with that regret ever since, you know, as the consequences have unfolded. So she's been on a journey too.
Yeah, and I must admit, one of the things that I found when I was reading it, and I don't know if other people have found this, but I think I would have been quite good friends with John and Marion had I been alive at that time and I knew them, you know, because they're very kind of independent people, and I'm quite an independent sort of person as well, you know.
They didn't tend to follow what everyone else was doing, but also they were able to see, to a certain extent, because things were a bit black and white. Yeah, that's maybe the wrong way to put it, but perhaps today. But in a way, they saw things very definitely in a way that today we get lost in a morass of grey.
Yeah, absolutely.
But along the way, the notes that I've read about them is they were well known as having a good sense of humour. They like to laugh.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that endears them to me for a start, you know, that they're not grim.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, for all it was quite a violent time, you know, in terms of, you know, everything that was going on with the Covenanters and stuff like that. It was a simpler time as well. You know, as you say, black and white, perhaps not the right way to describe it, maybe more right and wrong. People knew definitely what was right, what was wrong. There wasn't that grey.
They didn't know that it was right or wrong.
Right.
They were told it was right and it was wrong.
Yeah.
And it depended on the kind of mind you had, whether you questioned it.
Yeah.
But most people didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, that kind of comes back to the whole thing about belief, doesn't it? You know, if you believe in something, you don't really need to get some sort of physical proofs given to you. You just believe it, you know?
Yes.
And people who are less likely to believe, a bit like myself, are the ones who are going to question things.
Yes.
Not so much when you're small, and you're being educated, if you like, by your parents. But once you grow up and you start to think more as an independent person, then you kind of start to question things that people are telling you are right and wrong. And
also when you perhaps see things happening.
Yeah.
And it kind of triggers off a wee kind of question in your mind, and it sits there, and then you question it a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just human nature, isn't it?
Aye.
At the end of the day, you know. And so one of the interesting things as well about when he was going to Holland, because obviously Jonas takes him to his grandfather's farm, and John, being a farmer, quite naturally starts to think to himself, I wonder if there's things I can learn here.
Yes.
You know, or is there things that I can teach them, you know, methods that I use, you know? And again, that just shows you the humanity of the man. You
yes,
know,
I hope so.
While he's caught up in all this political intrigue, if you like, deep down, he's still just a farmer.
Yes. And the land at the end of the day is what really matters to him. Absolutely. And his relationship to it, which is quite a good way to be.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, he's not there a great length of time in Holland, and he comes back to Scotland, ostensibly to deliver from James Renwick to the societies, you know, a progress report. And of course, unbeknownst to John, when he's back, Renwick is already starting to make his way back, which I thought was a really interesting sort of dual thread to be following at the same time.
Right.
Because obviously, on the one hand, you get the impression that John thinks, right, I've washed my hands of James Renwick. You know, he probably knows that at some stage he's going to come back, but, you know, maybe a good few years down the line or whatever. And then when he does come across him again, it's a shock, but it's not a shock. I got that kind of sense. You know,
I think at the back of his mind, he knew that here was somebody who was going to affect his life much more than he wanted it to be affected. And he tried to put it to the back of his mind. Yeah. But it was really forced on him.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that, again, because of the kind of person that he was, he probably wouldn't have been able to not do it.
No, I couldn't imagine him saying absolutely and categorically no. Yeah. He would burn his ears, you know, by giving him his viewpoint. But when it came to the point of perhaps saving Renwick from himself so that he could go on and do a bit more, he would do that.
Yeah, yeah. Because, I mean, he obviously had the opportunity to maybe get away from it all, you know, with his wife and his children, just leave, maybe go to America or whatever it might be, and start again. But obviously his sense of right prevailed, if you like, in that respect. You know,
I think that's where the sense of the land mattering comes into it, because he felt that's where he belonged.
Yeah.
And I am not going to give that up, whatever happens.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. With book 3, obviously, as we know, it all follows on, from 1 to 2 to 3. But when you were writing book 3, because there seems to be a lot more threads are starting to come together, was it difficult to kind of pull them together? Or by that stage, were you so into it that, it was just a case of plucking one thread from here and one from there and then, tying them all up?
It was more the second. Right. It was more the second, because things were sort of hotting up, and things were coming in from different directions, and it seemed to me that I couldn't leave them out. So that's why you just got dum 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 dum, and it somehow seemed right at that point. Yeah.
So let's have a wee look at book 4 then, and again you've got this wonderful poem right at the beginning, which is really great. I love the title of it, Geese Turning.
Oh, that's great, that, yes.
Yes. When I seen that, it just made me laugh. And again, I just wanted to read a wee bit of it. In Bricht, Simmer Sun and Interkin Pass, a bloody skirmish, men slavery bound for hodding to their lord, for gainsaying the king. Some set free return to the law of beauty. And that was a really, really interesting bit of the book to read. That rescue, because it kind of showed to me really the similarity between John and Jonas.
Right, yes.
And I really, at that point, I thought to myself, do you know what? Jonas is a young version of John Steele.
Well, that's good.
For all he was born in a different country and he was raised in a different country, the absolute bottom line as a person was that he was the same person, and he knew what was right and what was wrong, and he would do his best to prevent wrong from happening.
Well, that's great that it came across.
And it was also made me laugh as well, because obviously Clavers is getting his tail tugged.
I wasn't a bit pleased about that.
Because, obviously at that point, I'm imagining that Claverhouse was probably thinking to himself that although John Steele hadn't gone away, he was becoming less of an issue for him.
That's right.
And therefore, he maybe was relaxing a wee bit too much in that respect, so that when John Steele pops up again, it's a surprise, but I don't really think it was a surprise to Claverhouse that John Steele was involved.
Well, I would think that where things suddenly go wrong for Claverhouse in the way that they do, where it's quite clever, he's not surprised to discover who's behind it.
Yeah. Because obviously we've known through the other 3 books that he has this respect for John Steele, perhaps not as a man, but as someone who knows what to do and how to get it done.
I think he sees him as an opponent, whom in actual fact, in his heart, he thinks, I'm not going to get the better of this one.
Yeah.
Not that he would ever admit it.
No, absolutely not. But it was good because in book 4, they all kind of come back together again, because of what happens at the rescue and all the rest of it. And it just kind of, basically it's like somebody's grabbed the pot and thrown it up in the air.
Yeah.
And let's see what lands outside the pot. And let's see what lands back inside the pot again.
Very much so, yes.
And that really appealed to me, because sometimes when you're reading books that are in a series, they kind of start to tail away, and you kind of lose interest in them unless there's something happens that kind of jolts you back into, oh my God, I need to think about this again when I'm reading this. I'm not just sitting looking at it and scanning the words. And I think that in book 4 does that.
Well, that's why I also chose the title Broken Times, because I wanted to kind of make people think, well, why is it broken?
Yeah, absolutely. I must admit, with the title, when I first saw the title, it didn't occur to me what was going to happen in it as that being the title. But as you say, once I had read and this had happened and they were all getting back together again, so to speak, it was like the wee light bulb moment. Oh, that's why that's there.
Yes.
This is what's happened. And again, not wanting to give away too much, but I really thought that a certain captain had got his comeuppance, finally. And you threw another spanner in the works, Ethel.
Aye.
Because I thought...
that particular one deserves all he gets. And more.
But the thing is that when I read it, and he is, to all intents and purposes, a goner, but he comes through it again. But at the same time, as well, I'm thinking, yes, we've got rid of him. I was a bit sad about it. But then when he kind of comes back, I'm like, oh yeah, this is, because I want him in there.
Uh-huh.
Probably more so than Claverhouse.
Right.
Because he's such a single-minded person, yes. And all he is interested in is getting John Steele.
Yes, he's obsessed.
And it doesn't seem to matter what is there, comes across him as a barrier. He's going to find a way around it. And
that's right.
The two, when he comes across Rennick and Jonas Hawthorne, and he obviously realises, that they're not who that they're meant to be, that they're shady, shall we say. I'm sure at the back of his mind, he's maybe thinking to himself, this could be a way for me to get to John Steele.
Yes. Yes. He sees that as his total focus, to the detriment of everything else, because in other ways, he probably was quite a fine military man.
Yeah.
But the obsession turned him into a monster.
Yeah. And I think the fact that he couldn't get the better of him.
That made it worse.
So far, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next two books.
Well,
far.
In book 5, he is definitely going to meet his nemesis.
Good. That's what I like to hear. Because just touching on book 5, obviously you said to me in the email, that it's getting delayed because of the whole pandemic situation, which I think is really quite sad. Because anybody who is reading the books just now, or who has read the books, I'm sure, like myself, they're waiting with bated breath for the next instalment to come.
Well, that's really good to know that people are keen to know the next bit. That's encouraging.
And the fact that it's getting delayed, albeit through no fault of anybody's, really, it just kind of deflates you a wee bit, because I was so looking forward to book 5, and then obviously book 6. But when you said in the email, that it was getting held up, I was like, oh. I was on a downer.
Well, the one for book 5 is called Lost Times.
Yeah.
So it's getting a wee bit hairy now.
Yeah, aye. And because I know in my own mind, I know that it's all rattling towards some sort of conclusion. But at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, I hope there's a 7th book.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. I'm struggling with 6 as it is, because 6 is meant to be the wrap up.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'm only at chapter 4 with it.
Yeah.
And I'm already finding that it's quite tricky tying up ends.
Yeah.
Tying up ends and trying not to do it in too obvious a way.
Yeah. And I think from my own personal point of view, I think it's because I have invested a lot in the characters through the books.
All right.
And therefore, I'm desperate to know what's going to happen to them, for good or for ill. Right. Obviously, obviously from the point of view of John and Marion, I want only the best to ever occur for them, no matter what happens. And for the likes of Crichton, I know he's probably going to meet a nasty end, and it'll be quite good when it comes, but I'll be sad when it comes as well. Kind of similar to the whole Gabby thing, because when he sort of betrays John Steele and injures his sister-in-law and all that kind of stuff, I found myself really hating him, whereas before I'd had a bit of sympathy for him because, he was this person who had no home and, you know, was
With a pair
wandering
of
the
feral.
countries. Exactly, yeah, you know. And then he turns out to be this nasty piece of work.
Yes, very much so.
And he gets away, and then he gets caught up again, and he gets his comeuppance from John Steele, and that's like, yeah. And the fact that it wasn't a violent end made it better for me as well.
Oh, right.
I think had he suffered violently at the hands of John Steele to end him, that would have been okay.
Right.
But from my own personal point of view, I think the way that it gets handled and how he deals with them probably injures him much more than any kind of physical punishment does.
Because I think he probably does realise that in spite of all that I've done, particularly to this man, he is not serving it back like revenge on a cold plate. He's not.
Absolutely.
And that probably would upset him. Because he's not that kind of person.
Yeah, and that's the thing with John's character as well. When you think of all the nasty things that happen to him throughout the books, you know, having to go on the run and, you know, missing his family and all the rest of it and losing his farms and all that kind of stuff, you would expect that to make someone very, very bitter.
And it didn't.
And it doesn't. You know, he accepts that it's just how it's happened, and he's always striving to get past it. But because of his character and needing to get involved with things that he shouldn't be getting involved in,
he slips up a few times.
He kind of gets dragged back. I'm trying to think of I think it's in the film The Godfather. I think it's in is it the final one, Godfather 4, where Michael says something along the lines of, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in." You know?
That's it, in a nutshell, yes.
When this was happening to John, that came to my mind.
Aye, very much so.
Although it's two totally different things, it's the character. You know, he thinks he's getting past it, and then something happens. And
it's all got to do with the kind of person that you are.
Yeah.
And that in spite of yourself, you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you don't want to, but you do. And that, I think, is part and parcel of the human psyche.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that comes across really well in the books. You know, I do believe that you've captured that with all of the characters that I've come across within the books. You really seem to have nailed them. You know, obviously with some of the historical real characters, it's maybe a wee bit easier because there are documents or whatever, you know, that kind of point you to how they were. But with the fictional ones that you've wove into the story, you've given them that same character traits, which for me anyway makes them much more real.
Good. That's super. The thing I would say about the real characters is when you do the research, you find that depending on who's writing it, the impression can be a wee bit different.
Yeah.
So you kind of read several different impressions and you think, well, somewhere in the middle, perhaps, just perhaps, is how that person is. So in actual fact, dealing with the real characters can, in a way, be more difficult.
Yeah, and of course, that's where research really pays off. You know, you don't look at like Wikipedia, for instance, and you read up about a Claverhouse on Wikipedia and you go, oh, that's what he was like. Because it's probably not what he was like. So you then find other sources, you know, and as you say, you look at several and then you kind of come somewhere in the middle of it, you know, and you're probably going to get quite close to it. And I think, you know, a lot of people don't realise when you're writing books, there is a lot of research, even if it's a pure fiction. There's still a lot of research needs to come into it because fiction in many ways is based in fact.
Oh, aye, definitely.
You know? But obviously, if you're writing something that has a historical context and has characters who are noted in history, then, you know, you do have to really make sure that you're getting right on the ball
well, as near as you possibly can.
Yeah.
The thing that comes out of it is that particularly with the likes of Claverhouse, in putting my nose a wee bit above the parapet, a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah.
They really don't like it. And quite interestingly, I read again quite recently a book by, it was James Hogg, called The Brownie of Bodbeck. And it's about the Ettrick Valley and what happened there, which was pretty terrible. And one of the things that James Hogg said at the end of it all, that he really tried to find something he could say that would be good about John Graham. And I failed completely. So that was his opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And do you find that you're reading more about that period or in and around that period since you started doing the books than possibly you would have done?
Oh, yes, because I want to, I'm always curious to find out now, what take has somebody else got on it? Is it anywhere near, what I've got? But I've got so far into how I see them that although I'm interested to see how someone else would react to them, it doesn't change my own reaction. That's quite embedded by now.
Because as I said to you before, I find that I'm now looking at things differently, and I'm going to try and find out things that I didn't know because they're popping up in your book, and I want to know a bit more about it. And I've learned a lot about that period of Scottish history that I knew nothing about.
Yes, well, that's really super, because if you can share something and stimulate a curiosity, that's a good thing. And that's what I try to do, for instance. Well, I've not been able to do it recently, but when I would do sort of speaking events, and I would speak about the background and try to word it in such a way that I would pull people in. And afterwards, quite a number of people would say to me, I'm going to have a wee look and see what else I can find out. We never got that at school.
Exactly.
I've heard that once, I've heard it 100 times. Is this really Scottish history? The short answer is yes.
Absolutely.
For good or bad, there it is. Have a wee look. It's where you came from.
Yeah, and another interesting byproduct for me is that I've actually started to seek out more things in Scots.
Right.
And I don't know if you're aware, on Indie Live Radio, we were featuring as an Artist of the Week a young singer, Iona Fife, who sings in Scots.
Yes.
And she took on Spotify because when she was listing her songs on Spotify, she couldn't put down that they were in Scots because it wasn't on there as a recognised language. It had Welsh, it had Cornish, it had all of those things, but it didn't have Scots. So she decided to take it upon herself, and it is now there.
Good for her.
So I was hoping to maybe get an interview with her. She did one with her daytime show, ladies, Val and Marlene, and I'd love to get one done.
I think you should try, because that sounds as if it would be of real interest.
Yeah. And as a result of that, I've come across a lot of other people who are starting to really identify now as Scots, and they're using the language, or in some instances perhaps not correctly using the language, but they're making that attempt.
Yes.
Because they're beginning to realise
there's a resurgence of the fact that perhaps the Scots are able to express themselves a little bit more different than the English.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of the words that we have are very explicit.
Yeah.
And when you try to translate it into English, you need 2 or 3 words to say the same thing.
I know,
to my way of thinking. I'm biased.
I've seen a thing on Twitter recently where, I can't remember who it was that put it up originally, but basically they were wanting people to say what their 3 favourite Scottish words were. So things like glaikit, and all that kind of stuff, And I was like, I've got too many. I can't say, this is my 3 favourites.
Yes, where would you find only 3?
I know, the fact that it is so regional variant as well.
Yes.
As you said to me the last time round, that, there are differences between how they would speak Scots down towards the border from, say, up in the central belt where Glasgow and Edinburgh and that is. And there would be probably big differences between Glasgow and Edinburgh then as there is now.
Yes. And that's all makes it richer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it does.
Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does. So I think we're kind of rapidly going to be running out of time soon. Just very, very briefly, in terms of when, book 5 is going to come out to us, I know we're looking at next year now.
Yes. The publisher has said early 2021.
Right, 22.
Sorry, I'm a year behind. I've been locked up for so long, I've forgotten where I am.
I was just going to say I can empathise with that. So, do you think then that book 6 will be quite quick behind it then?
Well, I've reached chapter 4 with book 6, and I'm just about to enter quite a tricky bit with it. And I'm trying to give a broad sweep, but trying to carry people, with me before I go back to the kind of the personal things. But you need the personal bit all the way through.
Definitely.
And in book 6, you'll discover how John deals with afterwards.
Yeah. And have you found it easier then to write during the lockdown, or has it made it a bit harder because you're not able to go out and, sort of visit libraries or places of interest to pick up bits and pieces of historical knowledge?
Well, yes and no, because to be quite honest, I've got quite a wealth of information that I can easily refer to.
Right.
And it hasn't been a bad thing not to be adding any more information, but saying to myself, right, what you've got, go with that. But then it doesn't work out because the bit that I'm at just now, I had got to a certain point and thought to myself, I don't know that. So I was forced to. But there hasn't been a lot of it. And it has given me, how would I say, space to just quietly walk about in the open air and think.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking, well, perhaps, as we used to see, the man in the yellow van will come for you. I can hear them talking to me.
Yeah.
I know that sounds ridiculous, but it just comes. And then later on, I think, so that's where they want to go.
Yeah.
And I would then check the information that I've got to see, well, would that be viable? Or would it be true?
Yeah, to be honest with you, that's not ridiculous to me at all, because I find that I'm not actually reading the books anymore. They're telling me.
Right, well, that's great. Great.
In my head, I hear probably a completely different way that John Steele's speaking to the way that you might hear it. But I can actually physically, when I'm looking at the page and I'm reading what it is, I can hear John Steele saying X, Y, Z, or Jonas Hawthorne saying X, Y, Z. So, that's how invested I've become in the books and the characters.
Well, that's great, because when you're writing, I think every writer would say that you want connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you can get the connection, it's a wonderful feeling to know that you've actually made it, even if it's just with one person. It's great.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's, as I said, it has made a big difference to me reading these books, both personally and, my knowledge historically has been greatly enhanced. So I'm just desperate now for book 5.
Well, I will personally see that you get a copy as quick as.
Because
I've got the cover done.
Yeah,
and it's been accepted, that they're happy with what I've done for the cover. So I've got the cover. We just need to get it all pulled together.
Yeah, because what we've decided to do is, obviously, when I notified my colleague Fiona, who does all the technical wizardry and pulls it all together for me, because I've got so many other things to do. Not that she doesn't. What we're going to do is, so it's going to be next year that we're going to be dealing with it. So what we would do is, just prior to when we broadcast the next one, we would run the first couple. So the first 4 books chats would be run beforehand, just to give people a wee reminder, right. So just to say, kind of like previously in NCIS this.
Right. If only.
although obviously it wouldn't be NCIS, That actually brings an interesting thought to me. Would you like to see it making its way to, like the big screen or the small screen even,
Short answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
In actual fact, my editor, now it would be about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, she tried to punt for that.
Right.
And STV did express, or ITV did express an interest, and then came back and said it would be too costly.
Right. I'm thinking, obviously, in terms of things like Outlander.
Uh-huh.
I knew people that had been watching that and had read the books, and they were always going on and on about it. And I had never actually seen a single episode of it until about probably just prior to the lockdown kicking in last year. And I'm now completely caught up in it.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do realise that there are quite a few historical inaccuracies in Outlander, but I kind of accept that because the lady who's written it, obviously she's an American, and so it's kind of stilted from her point of view. But as a piece of television drama,
it's pretty good.
It's good, and it's good escapism. But been reading, as I've been reading your books, I'm thinking to myself more and more, I would love to see that, making,
well, that would be my dream, was to see John Steele just walk across the screen.
Yeah,
and be John. But who it would be, I haven't a clue.
Yeah. I would venture to say that I would love to play John Steele, but I'm too wee and too old, and probably too round. So I would probably make a better Gabby.
Oh no! Don't say that. Gabby was very small and very thin, so you don't qualify in that. Right. And you've got a much better nature.
All right, I'll need to think of somebody else then that I could maybe play. But listen, so we'll end it on that rather cheery note, Ethel. It's been great speaking to you again.
You too.
Listen, you have a wonderful weekend for what's left of it.
And thanks for all your time and your patience.
It's been an absolute pleasure.